He had sold everything: horse, armor, the quiver of javelins that had made him famous, sold it all for a crate of wine and a private cabin on the trip home. He was sloshing about, but for the first time in days it was from the water lapping at the barge rather than from the wine he soaked down. He snatched at the ship's balustrade and bent his knees, letting the deck warble beneath his feet. He had grown weary from his accommodation and had come up for air. The room was small and dark, constructed from beams that seemed to sop up the sea like a sponge. The wet wood whined its complaints about every sway, dripping and dribbling to musty up a room already too dank. With as tightly as the walls were constructed, there was little room for an occupant after the hammock was strung and the luggage pulled in. Thankfully, he had sold everything to bring on only that one crate. The wine was not a particular blend, and too cheap to have heritage among the finer vintages. These were not the traits that concerned him, though. He chose the wine for the flavor and the feel. He wanted to drown in the contents of those black glass bottles, to wash away the muttered curses that littered his trail. What a trek it had been, too. Its conclusion was his destination, the port city Runa, bound to peek over the horizon in only a few hours. He stared the horizon down, his hands latching the bar tightly. It was a cold day, a gray day. Overboard, the silver-gleaming crests of the waves washed over the sea's shadow-black abyss. Overhead, charcoal shadows tucked and furled away from the sunshine caught in and seeping through the bloated, overcast clouds to glow with a blinding white ambiance. Both sea and sky drained into the ever-paling distance until they were at last lost to a pale fog on the horizon. Eyes perused the haze, patient for the details of Runa's harbor to leak through. The panorama begged like a blank canvas for something, any detail or tint beyond its monochrome palette, black and white. He spared it his imagination, washing it over with his reflections from the past several days. With any other talent he might have been spared this life, could have gone on to be something simple. There was nothing wrong with picking a pretty girl to be a husband to, wasting away spare hours on hobbies and problems that he made for himself. It was better than wasting hours on other people's problems. She would have his children, and he could teach them to throw nets, throw stitches, to throw anything except a javelin. Only hunters and soldiers threw javelins, and the shoulder he would pass on to his kin was not one to be wasted on game and wild swine. His decision to enlist had been pensive and reluctant, but he relented in the end as the benefits outweighed his doubts. Unified nations rarely sparred, and disputes were settled on polished, level tables rather than on the outcrops of battlefields. Unfortunately, this left the military's defensive reserves to become police units. The end of his spear had been turned toward the people of Escambreco. The Hexen reign did offer stability, but only by turning human on human, by having him betray his cousins, his family, his friends. He would consent to and endure this guilt no longer, however, and having served in Her Majesty's military was perhaps for the better, for now it granted him credibility as an instigator and tout. His father had warned him that it could happen, and in his youth he leisured imagining the chaotic day that the house of Hexen would bear no more daughters. He regarded that day as fantasy, though, treated it with a potential worth some spare paranoia, but certainly never actual investment. Never could he have imagined that he would survive witnessing the death of the crown princess and sole heir. Osmara would bear no more children. This was the end of a 9-generation dynasty, and a single generation to a witch was often 5 or 6 generations to a man. Osmara had been his mother's queen, his grandmother's queen, reigning back for so long that his family line faded into history long before Her Majesty's coronation. Osmara's birth had been foretold and assured as certain as the dawn, as had every queen's birth before her. The death of princesses spotted the past, but there was always another daughter to whom the throne could pass. Osmara was, however, the youngest daughter of her generation. Her older sister had passed before bearing an heir. Now Cassandra was dead. Now who was there to reign tomorrow? Paranoid thoughts festered to their potential conclusions. The Hexen line had ended, and with it every witch's promise mortgaged on the collateral of the curse's certainties and cycles. The witch's word now tendered nothing more than doubts and queries, answered only with heartache's wreckage and fear. First came the basal fears. Who would make the rules tomorrow? To survive, everyone needed But there was only so much anyone had, and there was always less tomorrow than there had been yesterday. It was possible to gamble for more by risking what was had. Failure, however, could be fatal, and there was no misery worse than knowing that what was needed had been given up. The rules by which things were risked could be changed, but someone had to lose for another to gain. No one trusted what was theirs to volunteers, who tended to cater the rules for their own gains. Nomination was the only way to secure access to what others had. A sense of community, of shared responsibility for what went wrong, had to be created, and that was a ruse. Selflessness, played by the maniacally selfish. To follow was a paranoid accounting of potential losses by tallying what one had. He measured his liquidated life, talent trained by a skill to a potential to kill, a face and name well respected, hopes for a small family before he became too old. He had not met her yet, but imagined a woman with dark hair tied back to finish the chores she assigned herself each morning. She needed to have as much direction in her life as he had in his. She would move into his mother's house, and his love would be like the foundation of their home, supporting her in all she did. They could pass that foundation on to their children, themselves potentials he dared not yet measure. Their loss would be too great to bear. He would rather not think about it. That was what the witches had always wanted, however. He was not supposed to think about it. He heard it from his officers and the merchants in the street. It is not your concern. All that he was left with were the games, the wine, and the women of his life, a mother, a sister, and a wife he had yet to meet. Acquiring her would require leaving the castle for something other than official business, but it was from the military affairs that he garnered the witch's recognition. It did not matter to him whether it was respect or resentment, as long as they acknowledged him, his effort, his capacity. The memory of his father's voice then berated him. Do not wait for the witches to lay your fortune at your feet. You are a worthy person with something to offer the world. This confused his direction. His talent deserved acknowledgment, but the witches acknowledged him only as a talented human, not as a person. He wanted more of their attention, but his attempts were costing him his dreams of a contented life. The witches were pressing him to live a contented life rather than meddle in their affairs. Do what the witches wanted him to do, or struggle to win the witches' approval. Either way, he felt his efforts were tainted. He roamed in a world of static failures, paralyzed by both his achievements and his pursuits. He had nothing to lose, and the misery was that meant he had nothing to risk, nothing to offer. Had his father lied to him? Anger replaced paranoia, then turned to blame. Witchcraft, binding him, relieving him, stealing from him pride and power to feed a shadowy deity who may no longer even exist. Consider, his rant echoed from the soapbox of his mind through the depths of his imagination, that if the hexen line died out, then did black magic ever divine right? Was there even this tenebrous deity managing their lives, or was it just an image, an illusion, as ineffectual as an actual shadow, in quiet mockery of the actions men took? He reveled in the thought that the power to change the circumstances might be his alone, and that black magic could not stop it, but could instead only observe and endure it. This was why he survived witnessing Cassandra die. This was why he found his way to this ferry, fate sailing it assuredly, safely back home. It was a home he could conquer and salvage from the witch's wicked snare. Maybe there was even hope, a glimmer of a chance that he could rectify the wrongs that plagued him, his father, his grandmother, his people. A spray of cold, salty sea kissed his cheeks to wake him from the nightmarish reflections and distant aspirations. Closer, however, were the creaking docks of Runa, creeping out of the foggy shore. Brass bells told directions in hollow, sharp strikes, navigating and negotiating the barge and pier ever closer together. Torches along the pier burned off the fog, hinting highlights of details still too distant. The boat was slowed, and ropes were cast to reel the ark in range of the gangplank. Shem was the first to disembark. He had no anchor on board, no cargo below deck to retrieve or porter to shore. He spared the boat one last glance, reflecting on his wreckage. His entire life was flotsam in the current. His ambitions drifted. He was jetsam on the shore. Achievement was not out of grasp yet, however. It was still something, always something that could be salvaged by those who tried. He would be there to make the rules. First, though, he needed a place to rest, a meal, then he could set out in the morning. Cold zephyrs in the night were brisk enough to scour the clouds from the sky. The uninhibited sun was liberal with its rays, shining so brightly that eyes were blinded and shied away long before they saw its full radiance. His shadow had a distinct silhouette, warped only by the cobblestone path on which it was cast. It scared him, reminded him too much of the desert. His survival of that cursed place seemed to further support his claim. He needed to share the theory. First, however, he had to find those who would listen. He carried on, his eyes staring straight ahead in an attempt to cower from both the sun and his shadow. He walked into the castle's gaping maw of a gate, swallowed into the inner ward. He crossed the courtyard at the base of the keep, with its iron gate partitioning away the terraced gardens that scaled up and around the curve of the foremost tower. He turned from the ivy vines of flowers and herbs that cascaded down the steps toward the grassy plain beyond the next gate. Stables, constructed from pale wood, lined the wall beneath the battlement walks. He saw a groom, Melanie, toiling. She was just another human too involved in the witch's world. The wall walk rolled along, broken next by the foundry, the antithesis of equality. Yes, there were human smiths. Demand for them was too high even in the hamlets buried days deep in the mountains far south and west of Castle Osmara. It was not merely a trade, however. It was a skill. It was an art. It was the epitome of creation, where dust, weak and crumbled and sad, was transformed with patience and care and the tease of fire's tickling tongue into something sure, certain, stable, and unique for its capacity to revolt and repulse the Fae. The fairies were a quality, being just as treacherous to humans as they were to witches. The foundry, however, was not. Enlisted for 20 years and renowned for a shoulder that could hurl a spear further and more accurately than any other, man or warlock, Shem was privy to facts from which most humans, with a life expectancy 1/5 a witch's, were excused. In these walls, among the ranks, that workshop defined potential. Admittance was restricted. Every stud strutting his bare chest burned hairless and worked rippled was a warlock. You did not polish a single blade without evidence of heritage, then further restricted only to males, and not without referrals written by hands already well regarded by the master smith. Every warlock enlisted in the Order of Valish required a degree of mastery of the Forge's secrets to make them eligible to be its next master, though almost none would dare try for the post. Anyone attempting major also needed a letter of recommendation from the Forge master. Acolytes in both the cleric and prelatic orders studied its mysteries. In this regard, enrollment settled for the witches a philosophical dispute as to whether their penchant for violence by the sword was or was not better than execution by more occult means. The result was a fraternal order in a matriarchal world, whose elite were regarded as the ultimate stock. He had seen the status garnered by the louts admitted. They would go in as cowards with weak morals and pathetic deportment, then were delivered honed, refined, polished in glinting black armor etched with silver, wrought by their own hands, and often with a title to match. Posts were rare to open, and titles were hard to gain. Humans and witches alike enlisted in the ranks, and those of superior talent, dedication, or obedience were promoted to sergeant. This was the highest humans could hope to achieve in Her Majesty's military, to direct operations and administer commands to humans. To be promoted next to lieutenant meant being able to take over in lieu of the captain, and this potential was too much of a risk for the witches to leave to a human. Lieutenants were the eyes, ears, mouth, and hands of their captains. Generals selected the captains and assigned them to the Queen's various military objectives. The generals further selected from their ranks troop members who would act as their weapons specialists, and a squire major, the military order's equivalent of heir apparent. The witch's obsession with mentoring power made fairly certain that titles were never conferred by heritage, but instead earned through impression and favoritism. He had certainly impressed with his pitched spears, but his heritage was his shackle. He earned a crew, whom in maneuvers he played as pawns to defend him while he hurled javelin after javelin until his objective was met. The men he led, usually huddled behind tall shields, carrying guisarmes and axes, were almost exclusively human, and hooted with drunken pride when they were able to outperform their witch-born counterparts. They made their own exclusive fraternity, flaunting their wins in the mess hall with mocking songs and tankards of foaming golden ale. The witches brooded in their losses, but feigned forgiveness. Patience would eventually grant them the satisfaction of his relatively early death. Goading them was all he could do to make them remember him, acknowledge him, his worth, his ability to offer something to this world, not depend on them, not let them settle with their assumption that he could be ruled. He would not wait on an offer. He would claim what he wanted and be a credit to human will. His will was, after all, just as strong as a witch's. The only difference between him and a witch was black magic's refusal to let him use his will to warp the world around him. Instead, he walked in the bleak realization of what already was, accepting equally what he did and what he could not achieve. He passed the forge and started to the armory tower adjacent the keep. It was smaller, but bitterly well armed. The generals kept apartments in the upper floors, barracks and weapon racks the next set down. He passed through the gatehouse with its portcullis and double doors, through the cavernous basement that garaged the catapults and ballistas. The stairs built into the far wall did not curve defensively because it was considered impossible for the tower to fall. Instead, the stairs were straight so that reinforcements could easily descend. He scaled the stairs to the next story, the great mess hall. It too was cavernous, like the garage below, but was strewn with long tables where the enlisted took meals and orders. The room was in a ruckus from the crowd gathered for a lunch of stew, thick with sausage and roots. Jeers from rivals and cheers from his men celebrated his entry. Tankards, filled sadly with water rather than wine, were raised with invitations to join his comrades at a table. He crossed the room, patting shoulders of friends among the ranks as he worked his way over. He crashed to the bench and shared a warm smile to hide his cold motives. "Shem," varied voices cried, "where have you been?" He answered with a laugh and a sigh and a dry, thirsty slam back of the water in the past tankard, then preluded his first word with a wry smirk. "How are you boys doing? Kept busy?" "We have needed you for the past couple games," one answered. "Things have been quiet, routine," another supplied. It was not that they were nondescript, but merely that Shem was too distracted discerning targets to pay attention to whom answered the small talk. He would rather get down to business. "Look, it's Captain Karsak." Shem's timing seemed perfect, natural, noting the silver-blonde officer just as he stood. This was not the first time Karsak had come to Shem's attention. Their bitter quips had chipped away at their respective facades, and the soldiers leisured in examining the exposed psychologies. They tallied the witty jabs and retorts and made wagers on which underdog would win. Karsak was talented, but cocky and hot-tempered, content to lose a few if he stood a chance to win big. He was easily snared by Shem's baiting. Shem's plans depended on the next discourse playing out in front of the ranks. "Captain!" Shem instigated with a winning smile and an inviting wave. Karsak noted the hail, spared his lieutenants a sarcastic glance, then strutted to the sergeant with a sparing, consolatory pretension. "Shem, a pleasure to see you back. Did your crops need tending, or did you just sink your days away in the depths of a bottle and a widow's thighs?" Their conversation had turned vulgar quickly. The witches had reserved for themselves any occupation with credit or art, leaving humans to labor away their short lives, convinced their boredom was their gift, rightfully spent on games and wine and the nuanced dramas of love. Shem had never been content, and this Karsak knew too well. Shem wanted to bite back, but bit his tongue instead for a greater prize. "You look exhausted, Captain," Shem charmed. "Is your work too much for you?" "Never!" Karsak whinnied his objection and shook his head. "Granted, I've been busy. 4 extra platoons have temporarily been assigned under my command. It is a lot of responsibility to be trusted with so much, but I would not say exhausting. Just consider yourself lucky that it is nothing you'll ever need to worry yourself with." "But it does worry me." Shem leaned back against the table and crossed his arms. He did hope one day to be trusted just as Karsak was, and Karsak's disregard for his potential made Shem eager to outperform and disprove. He grinned, sinister. "I cannot let my favorite captain take ill." "Oh, do you want to help? Hey, how about you join my company? I would love to have you under my command. With all of these soldiers, it can be hard to keep track of which human is which." Karsak could try to goad, but Shem was content with his grander scheme. He could risk a loss for a bigger win. "Where did these extra units come from, anyway?" Karsak was disarmed by Shem's civil turn in conversation. "Captains who are away." "Which captains?" Shem needed to watch his tone. He had blurted this eagerly, almost demandingly. Terracon and Eloise. Wow, helping two fellow captains. You are a hero. So Terracon and Eloise are both absent? Where are they? Assignments. Do not worry, though. It is not your concern. Karsak baited again. Shem smiled. You are right. He closed and turned away from the captain, back to the tankard on the table. He soaked the water down with contented closed eyes. Karsak hovered, sneering at Shem's abrupt conclusion of their conversation, then shook off the distraction without credit or consideration to march out of the mess hall. Shem peeked to spy over the brim of his cup, for whose attention he still had. The men around him, decked in half-plate and leather, were themselves suspicious, glancing amongst one another for some sense of what happened. Shem's rebuttals were weak. Where was their hero? Shem took his cue. Did you hear what he said? Terracon and Eloise are on assignment. Yeah, bubbled up a response from one soldier, his seniority among the men marked by the silver streaks in his mustache, a portly constitution, and the right to be first in answering their commander. He did nothing to hide the confusion twisting his face and staining his tone. But that is not much news to be making a fuss about. Shem leaned in over the smoothly worn table, hiding between his hunched shoulders. But it is, Macer. But it is. He turned his gaze among the other men gathered. Where are Eloise and Terracon? Can anyone say? You know damn well we're not privy to that, another fellow with closely cropped black hair threw out. It's not our concern. They are busy. I know it is hard, but be curious for just 1 minute, Shem snarled. Why have 2 captains been simultaneously dismissed without the accompaniment of a single platoon? Answer that. More so, Terracon is Her Highness's custodian. Where is he ever but at Princess Cassandra's side? This he let hang in their consideration until it percolated into anticipation of his next point. Where are you going with this? Macer probed. Tonight, if you can. Meet me at the abalone plate. That is back in town, came the loud contest. Shut! Shem caught his own loud outburst, capping it shut behind clenched teeth to instead hiss, Keep it down! The abalone plate, he enunciated slowly, then amended. I will buy a round if it is the only way I can get you there to hear me out. There is foul play, and what I have to tell cannot be told here. Macer cut Shem off. You smell like wine. I do not want to waste an evening on some paranoid thought that has caught your fancy, especially if I have to drown a drum just to keep up with it. Where have I been, Macer? Ask me where I have been. Where have you been? Macer sneered. With Terracon. The words leaked from his lips, slipping into the ears that struggled to strain Shem's words from the cafeteria's cacophony. The royal custodian is on assignment, eh? Well, so was I. If you do not believe me, then go and see what Melanie has to say on the matter. He stood up. Keep it quiet, and find me at the abalone plate. He nicked his brow as a departing salutation, then exited the mess without an official assignment.